This podcast is presented by InsideOutMusic. And this month's featured release is by a band called Molly Baron. Their new album is called Something Ominous. And if that isn't ominous enough for you, then I don't know what to tell you, man. You need less drama in your life. Hey everyone, Devon here again for the next interview on the Devin Townsend Podcast. Today's guest is Tosin Abasi. Tosin is a member of the brilliant band Animals as Leaders. He is a innovative thinker, incredible player, amazing mind, and a solid dude. I'm very happy to know him and very happy to interview him. So that being said, I'm just coming out of head cold and my brain, you ever have those days when your brain is just, you can't think of the words that you're trying to say, the most rudimentary things. I was struggling with that while doing this interview today, so forgive my absent-mindedness during this. But until next month, enjoy. Tosin Genius. See ya. I really appreciate you doing this, man. I know it's Sunday and it's fucking doing this shit sucks, man. So thank you.
I love talking to you, so so it's fine.
Okay, great, man.
I'm trying to get my AirPods. Okay, wait. Go ahead and talk.
Hey. Yeah.
I feel like okay. Well,
if you go to preferences on the corner of Zoom and just go up to preferences and then go down to audio, then you can select your input and output there, I think.
Zoom preferences, audio output. Okay.
Yeah, dude.
A true genius.
I'm actually surprised that you consider yourself a Luddite.
You know the actual definition of, like, I am not a Luddite.
What's the actual definition of Luddite?
So I feel the Luddites were an actual community of people that were I think this was during the Industrial Revolution, if I'm not mistaken. And I think for legitimate reasons, they were opposed to this proliferation of technology that was like going to replace them, if I'm not mistaken. But now it's kind of used as like someone who's just anti-technology, which neither you nor I are. So...
Well, that's a good place to start, man, because it's like this is the second interview that I've done, and I'm trying to learn how to do it. And one of the main things is just shutting the fuck up. That's the hardest thing to do when you're actually in the position of asking people questions, because you so often just want to interject with your thoughts. I struggle to find people that I want to talk to. You know what I mean?
I get it.
Yeah. And we've toured enough together that I've really enjoyed our interactions, man. They're like similar pages, and I'd be thrilled to ask you some of the same questions that I'm struggling with myself, and in hopes that the insights into your process will be of some value to the people who are watching this. So,
oh yeah, I love it.
Right on, man. Okay, so I think the first thing that I'd love to ask you is, before we get too deep into the conceptual aspects of it, at this time of your life, when you're in a compositional stage, what's your process look like? Are you doing it on your own with a DAW? Or are you jamming with a band? Or are you with a drummer? Or what's it look like at this point?
Okay. The process is in two different, where all the ideas begin on the guitar. And it's usually because I'll be messing around, maybe mindlessly, and then some musical happy accident occurs, and you kind of notice it, and you're like, oh, whoa, that was kind of cool. And then I'll try to capture that, and then I begin a conscious process of like, oh, I should drop a beat here, or I need a new chord. But it's usually a spontaneous thing where I like find myself almost spontaneously playing the seeds of a new riff or a new idea. And it's always been like that. And I used to keep a mental bank of these. and I would refine them over time, maybe add parts, but I just had a working memory of like these little riff fragments. Then sometimes I realized a few of them go together. But it's so guitar centric because that is my only that is my primary tool, is the guitar, you know. This is well before everyone was like using DAWs and had home recording setups and all this stuff. So I just have somehow always stuck to this as like the starting point of a musical idea. And then usually maybe I'll make a little demo inside of like Logic or something like that, just to kind of catalog it. But when it's time to record an album, I usually bring forth all these partial ideas to the band. And then we all begin to kind of compose together. So we'll track in, maybe there's 3 riffs, or 2, and we'll track them in to a DAW, and then we'll begin to program drums and then start to mess with the arrangement. And then maybe Javier is going to add a layer, or he has something he's been working on independently that actually works with what I'm doing. But I don't really have like a magical process other than taking edibles every once in a while and escaping myself, you know.
Do you so when you say that you're documenting it sort of internally, so that's still the case? So you're making mental notes as to which of those ideas are intriguing, and then the ones that are intriguing enough just inevitably are the ones that stick around, I guess, right?
Yeah. So I've had large periods of time where I felt like I could write a song every day type of thing. And then I'm like, well, not all these songs are created equal. It's an interesting exercise. I've heard of some songwriters actually tasking themselves with writing almost daily, or turning that into its own process of refinement, where you're less concerned with the songs themselves than the process of writing the songs, and how maybe through really like doing that as like a diligent thing, you can actually refine your songwriting ability. So that's something I've toyed with. And I've noticed you have like a prolific output. So I feel like you might be in this category of like constantly inspired, and then also like just churning out the songs. Like there will be songs. It's like, I don't know what percentage of songs you're not writing, but the percentage of songs you are writing.
Well, it's exactly what you say, man. It's I think when I'm in the frame of mind where I'm churning it out, it's much more about the process. And conceptually, it's conceptually, it's almost entirely about the process. But I find that there's, to the detriment of the songs that have a long-term impact on myself, where I'm able to reflect on those pieces of music and say, okay, those accurately defined a certain period of time. Rarely were those ones based on churning it out. It's the ones that, like you say, were like a spark of an idea that just sort of gestate over time, and then they become undeniable. So when you are writing, is like, because obviously Animals is a group, but when you're writing, how much does concept play into your work?
You know, it's a good question, because I feel like I am inspired by all sorts of concepts. Like, I love science fiction, but I also love like brutalist architecture, or I love fashion, certain design. So there's an aesthetic universe, and it's not all art or music, but aesthetics is the sort of central theme to the things I'm talking about, whether they inspire awe, or they require creativity, or so when I go to write, I feel like it is trying to distill a lot of these aesthetic sort of these things I appreciate aesthetically. I'm trying to distill them into like the musical version of that, right? So I want the listener to have some sort of impact that, whether they know it or not, kind of gives them hints of the things that are always floating around in my mind, you know?
Awesome, dude. Man, I'm so glad to hear you say that. I relate so much, and it seems like an abstract concept to some other people that I've talked to about similar topics. Could you go further into it? So, like, when it comes to aesthetics, like brutalist architecture, or I know that your hobbies would include like automobiles, and the design of your guitars are all aesthetically And when I look at the artwork for a lot of the work that you guys have done recently, it's got a very definite vibe that each record you put on, it's almost like you're trying to introduce, like you say, to your audience, like, well, here's a frame of mind that you can rely upon when you get into this record. In a real practical sense, how would you explain your process of articulating something that's not music into a musical form?
Yeah, okay. That's a good question. There's low-hanging fruit, like with song titles, So you can literally label a song in a way that steers the thoughts of the listener in a certain way. Like we have a song called An Infinite Regression, and I was reading some book, and I'll often be reading and I'll steal a sentence or a fraction of a sentence and use it out of context. For whatever reason, it leaps out of me, and I'm like, oh, that's a good song title. And I've started doing this with things that are absolutely, you'd never name a song this. I wish I had some examples, but it's like, I'll text next time I think of one, I'm going to text you.
I'd love it.
Because I think you'd appreciate this. But so the low-hanging fruit as far as like giving the listener a conceptual framework is what you call the song. I think you're really good at this actually with like a lot of your song titles or album titles. It's like, oh, okay, I get it. Even without the lyrics, it's like I kind of get the environment in which this is going to take place. So I don't have lyrics, but I'll name songs stuff like Arithmophobia, where it's like I like the idea of an irrational fear of numbers. And that particular song it was actually a drum composition where we wrote the notes to the drums, and it's super angular and counterintuitive. So I was like, the song will exist, and then I will reverse engineer kind of what I'm feeling from the song and attach a song title to it that usually evokes in some direction what I think the vibe of the song is. The other thing you can do is just the aesthetic of the production. How much ambience is in the background, how much is like synthetic sound sources versus like drums, bass, and guitar. I don't know if you've thought about this, but it's like, this happens to me a lot where I'll be playing the guitar on my own and I'll realize that if I didn't treat it like a metal song, the same like musical idea could be represented in a totally different genre and still have some musical worth.
Mm-hmm.
So part of the aesthetic is the fact that we are choosing to have like distortion on the guitars and heavy drums and all of these are aesthetic choices too. It's packaged. It's like kind of this Animals as Leaders has this progressive metal packaging, right? So that is like a sonic aesthetic. And then I think the third opportunity is with artwork, like you were mentioning, where it's like, that is super impactful. Like the way you, it's like, what fonts are you choosing? What color palette, what imagery? Because like, it's interesting. And I don't know if I feel like you're always going to release albums. Like you'll never just be like, download it on Spotify and here's the thing or whatever. But it's like, we remember holding like physical records and looking through the booklet while you're listening to the album, and like the artwork was super meaningful.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes when you think of the record, you think of the artwork or any number of these things. So I think that is like another low-hanging fruit for like kind of giving your work an aesthetic sort of communication. And then the last part is a little bit more in the harmony and in the rhythms. And it's like, so you and I both like modal harmony, I think that's an aesthetic you don't find out. So it's evocative, like using modal harmony is evocative, especially when you sing. You don't always hear people singing in Lydian or something like that. So it hits the brain from this sort of outside angle. So I'm always searching for harmony that sits outside of people's comfort zones, because I want to elicit a response in them that is not super available, but I want them to feel something but not be quite sure what it is they're feeling, if that makes sense.
It does.
So yeah, that's my central, it's like, that's pretty central to how I want to use harmony and rhythm. It's like novel experiences that feel like an amalgam. It's not quite sad, but it's not quite not sad. It's not, what I mean? It's like, oh, this is this it's like this is kind of a disconcerting or uncomfortable melody, but it's also kind of melodic, you know? So there's all these little tricks you can do to kind of induce that feeling.
Well, that leads me to two questions about that. So first off, do you consciously architect your intent? So with that, I mean, do you focus on things in your daily life that would provoke in you things that push you towards an aesthetic that you're interested in? Like, is your daily life a part of your compositional world? And then the second part of the question is, do you think it would be possible to teach people how to follow this kind of compositional method?
I am not as fully integrated as that question sounds, like where my waking life is part of my creative process in a conscious way. But I think that's super. You know what? Maybe once the album process has begun, you're kind of in a headspace. And I feel like you probably relate to this, but then like you're working on the record and then you're probably constantly thinking about it through your daily, you know? So I think when that process begins, then I'm kind of like a little bit more infusing the creative process into like my waking life. Even if I'm not holding a guitar, I might be thinking in that direction. But I haven't really, I personally have a relationship with creativity where there are big swaths of time where, at least lately, where I don't really play guitar and I kind of like take a few weeks off and I am not thinking about it. And maybe I'm not even listening to that much music. And then for whatever reason, I get these intermittent bursts of inspiration. And then it's like, there's riffs. I don't know why, but now the guitar seems fresh and I'm spitting this stuff out. So that is kind of what I've accepted as like part of my process, like allowing this like ebb and flow of inspiration. I haven't developed this sort of like thoroughly integrated way of life where I'm always channeling creativity into my waking life and vice versa. Could you teach it? You probably could teach, you could attempt to teach most things, but I don't know if you could successfully teach, you know? It's like people study Shakespeare, but because you can distill it into, you know, literary concepts doesn't mean that you're going to produce a Shakespeare.
No,
Do you know
and
what I mean?
I absolutely know what you mean. I think more so than even reaching for those sorts of heights. When I was listening to your most recent record on the way to do the tour, I remember looking at the cover and thinking the music sounds like that. You know,
That's
and
cool.
then when he released the video, it was like the video sounds like the album cover suggested the music was going to sound. Next question I would love to ask is, okay, so you're saying you're not playing a lot, and I totally relate, man. I mean, there's so much stuff going on. It's like hard to like just actually sit and practice guitar, right? How do you deal with writer's block?
Writer's block used to be more distressing to me, and I would feel like I needed to deal with it. And I would do things like really embrace that I'm a guitar player first, and I'd be like, oh, well, you might need to just like learn some more stuff on the guitar. So I'd like go online and search out either new music. Finding an album you're in love with for me is one of the best ways to become inspired, because you're just like, you get that feeling again. And I don't know why, but it's like when someone releases a body of work that makes me feel feelings, for some reason it gives me some sort of motivation to do the same. Sometimes I even emulation, I might be like, dude, I love how minimal this is, or I love how maximalist it is, but whatever. It can inspire new inspiration. So if that doesn't happen, I'll literally just learn new concepts on the guitar, like discovering new scales. Not like there's an endless amount of scales, but the guitar is funny where it's like you can know how to play and still learn things. And especially if you look outside of your own box, you can find like either rhythmic concepts or melodic concepts. So I've escaped writer's block by just becoming a student again very often and being like, oh, what's harmonic major? I didn't know there was a harmonic major scale. I'm like, whoa, this has some interesting intervals in it. And then that usually starts like the ball rolling. It's kind of interesting to me that the guitar is fixed, like the same amount of frets, the same amount of strings, but you are the variable. So like the guitar doesn't change, but you are always in a state of a type of fluidity. So every time you touch this static instrument, it's actually you that is bringing forth new things from this thing. The guitar is a physical object that technically isn't different than the last time you picked it up, but you are. You know what I mean?
Yeah, it's a hammer.
It's low key. And there's a lot of shit to nail in. It's like it doesn't get old, but it's kind of like cool. So so sometimes I try to recognize that if I'm feeling stuck, there's probably some internal change that should occur because the guitar is not going to change. And then
that's
the
great.
other, yeah,
that's great, man. I think that's actually very helpful to people to actually recognize that even as a sideline, if you are stuck, because I'm sure you get asked at least as much as I do, what do you do when you get stuck? But perhaps the fact that you're stuck is in part you could even perceive it as okay, well, there's a block there that I'm not past, that next level up that I need to get through by either dealing with this or getting through this difficult period or this bland period or whatever it is something that is less about the instrument and less about changing guitars or getting a new amp or whatever, and more about just. This is another question I was going to ask, and forgive me for them being as out there as they are. It's good actually when people don't relate to it as well, because that helps in a sense. But the question is, with that in mind, what's the foundation of your intent? It sounds stupid, but what I guess I'm trying to say is like, so what is it that started your journey into music, and what keeps you in it? Like that, the impetus to create, what is that rooted in, if you were to dig at it?
dang. Yeah. I feel like we're deep enough into our careers to where it's like thinking about what made you want to start can be like, it's like, did you lose touch with the thing that made you want to do all this in the first place, you know? For me, it was that I noticed when I was a little kid listening to MTV that if like a certain Michael Jackson song came on or a certain Whitney Houston or something, I would like feel happier or want to move around. And I think I noticed like, damn, every time this song comes on, I feel a thing. And I found that really interesting for some reason. I don't know why, but it was like the vibe change felt kind of, it didn't feel mundane. And I was like, so that was like the first seed. And then honestly, when I first started playing guitar, it seemed like one of many activities like skateboarding and video games and then guitar. I found some weird, I just fixated on the process of not being able to do something and then spending time practicing it and then being able to do it 3 days later or a week later or a month later. And I didn't think much further beyond that. But I thought it was cool that the result was music. It's like, oh, he can play that song that's always on the radio, you know? And it was like these little small victories. But I realized that the flow state of practice, I think I was actually responding to the whole flow state thing, where you don't notice how much time has passed and you feel fully focused and integrated. Like it's kind of this conscious experience of coherence that is like, the flow states are a thing. The listener, you should look at it. I know you know what these are. So what made me want to start making my own music, I think, was I never really consciously thought about it, but I felt like that's what you should do if you are playing an instrument. Like not only do you know how to play people's stuff, but you make stuff too.
Yeah.
The first music that inspired me was actually Nirvana, where I felt like complex emotions. It's like this is dark, but it also like is like kind of pissed, but it's also kind of like the lyrics were strangely like nonsensical at times. And as a young kid, I hadn't encountered, this is not Whitney Houston. Do you know what I'm saying? It's like Kurt Cobain had some demons. And like
so did Whitney Houston, though, to be fair.
Oh shit. Yeah.
Yeah.
They just didn't end up in her, the producers didn't let her put her demons into her music.
Which is a shame, I think. On some level, it would have been awesome if she had that one album that her fan base was just like, holy shit, man. Like that's that's
too real.
That's too real, man. Like what was
Too
that one
real.
I heard the other day with Pat Metheny that was with Thurston Moore, like he did the song.
Wow.
And it's noise, right? And it's but I love the fact that was a part of his canon of work. And forgive me for just asking all these questions again, but I love the idea as well that what it seems like on some level is it's the complexity of the emotions were like a puzzle in a way. To sort. You're like, well, there's a bunch of things happening at the same time, and that's making me feel that within myself. So what are the components to that?
Yes. So you're starting with this raw emotional experience of emotional complexity, but if you are a musician, you start to feel like, how can I make my music produce this same feeling? At least that's what I wanted. Because it's funny you bring up Whitney Houston and the fact that she had demons. Her brand did not allow for her to be fully human in her music in this way. Totally. Her fans wouldn't have allowed it. The producers wouldn't have allowed it. So I gravitated towards artists who weren't restricted in this way, and they were communicating honest and sometimes uncomfortable things with their instruments, or with their voices. So that started to become interesting to me. And then I don't know what it is, but the impact of someone playing an instrument like really precisely and fast and clean hit too. Like the first time I heard Yngwie Malmsteen, I was just like, oh my God.
Do man.
Yeah. I was like this. And I just from that point started really drilling hours of, so it's kind of interesting because like I remember listening when we did the Beata interview, you had some processes of like, you talked about like when it rained, using that as like sitting and like meditating on the rain as like an inspiration for like, and then I started to feel like, fuck, I'm not like vibed out enough. Like I'm not connected enough with like the type of evocative source material that is kind of all around me. Cause I've kind of gone down this like technical rabbit hole where maybe my peripheral isn't incorporating my environment, the things that could be kind of inspiration. So it kind of gave me pause, and I was like, I should think more about how I'm doing what I'm doing.
Well, may I ask then, because you said something that played into that I'm curious about, in that your reason for following the Nirvana type of artist versus the Whitney type of artist, where their brand doesn't allow for that type of humanity. Were you interested in those emotions as just out of curiosity, or because it resonated with you?
Okay, good question. I didn't know I was interested in them, because if you're only hearing top 40 pop music, it's like I love Phil Collins and I love, there was the stuff that was on the radio constantly, great music, but there was the stuff that was underground or more alternative that was like way less palatable. And so these musical experiences were not even available to me because they weren't in the mainstream. So it was because actually guitar, I started to search out guitar music, and then I started to encounter like, whoa, there's these musical ideas that are just like challenging. And then I remember, this sounds kind of cheesy, but I remember hearing Metallica's Black Album, and it was like Nothing Else Matters. And it was like, damn, I remember the music video was this guy who was basically in this like prison, and he grew old and slowly died over time. And the moment he was about to escape, he like finally falls dead. And I'm like, bro, there's something dark about it all that I just rarely encountered. And it's kind of funny when you're uncomfortable, but you like it.
Are you okay with like horror films and things like that? Do those things appeal to you?
Horror done correctly gives me the same feeling. So like and I don't know, I know you protect your consciousness, but I also know you're no stranger to the darkness.
Mm-hmm.
So there are conscious experiences that everyone experiences, and the dark parts of our psyche don't really get encoded all the time in our art. When it comes to music, people just want to dance or have a love song or something. And to me, making metal is almost like making horror films. It is acknowledging the dark part of our psyche and giving it voice, because most of the time we pretend that we don't have it. And so some horror is gratuitous violence, and I don't think there's much value there. But when it's done correctly, it's as impactful as like an uncomfortable dream, which we all have, you know? And so I think there's a certain power in this sort of this, I don't want to just say dark side, but there's a certain gravity it has, a certain power that I found compelling. It's not quite violent, but it's like, put on that first Strapping Young Lad album and tell me it's not the type of
the second one's
the second one.
and the fourth one's fucked. But I wonder, because it's like the process of talking to people whom I respect, like yourself, and their process is ultimately selfish, because I'm trying to figure it out myself. I'm working on something new, and I'm like, every time I start a new process, it gets rekindled, and I'm wondering, and I may at the end of this think, oh, it's of no value to me, but I wonder if the process of analysis of what your intent is. For example, when you're talking about the complexity of those emotions, because they're like a jumble of things. It's not like happy, sad, you know what I mean? It's like a lot of things at once. And to be able to deconstruct that and be able to look at it in its individual parts, it's a similar process, I would imagine, as learning to refine a technically challenging piece. But the question is the interest in that, is it to do with like just throwing it out? Is it to do with, are we afraid of it and we feel that we're less afraid by confronting it? Or is it simply just curiosity? Or is it just, do you have any guess?
Well, so for me, it's because when I experience it, I like it. So if another artist communicates this type of complexity, I find it more stimulating than if it was just like less complex in its emotional communication.
Mm-hmm.
And I've actually feel this way about aesthetics. Like, if you take brutalism, like, it's largely concrete structures that are very geometric. There's like this overt, almost, it doesn't look like human hands formed these structures. There's almost like this sort of like embracing of, it's not soulless, but it doesn't seem organic, if that makes sense.
It does, yeah.
And it has gravity. And even the conspicuous, like, there's lots of use of facets and angles, and there's a lot of this. I think the brain can take this sense data, and even though you're looking at a structure, it has some sort of weight emotionally inside of you. There's certain designers like Rick Owens, or where it's like they'll do weird, almost ugly things on purpose. They'll make a garment that in some ways looks slightly deformed in some parts of the silhouette, or they'll use materials that, so I think like with music you can do a similar thing with contrast. So when you were describing trying to figure out to systematically produce this emotional complexity, sometimes it's literally just contrasting melodic content that maybe shouldn't be right up against each other, or textural elements that don't necessarily coexist, and then the discord is actually greater than the sum of its parts and produces a type of like stimulus where you're like, I feel something. I don't know exactly what it is. I like it, but I'm also slightly uncomfortable.
I think that's amazing. And I also think I follow this Instagram feed on brutalism as well, which I absolutely know what you mean in terms of that aesthetic. And I think that your description of it makes me think, well, I wonder if the thing that appeals to me about it is the fact that it looks like there's a construction involved with it that's separate from people in a way. And I think it's when you mentioned that my affinity towards nature as an impetus to write, I think it's coming from a similar thing. And it's the problem is it veers very quickly into theistic kinds of discussions, which I think negates what it is that I'm interested in. It's like a primal intent, you know? And it's like with the brutalism things that I follow, the architecture that I've seen that you're probably referring to, it is so profoundly you know, and I think
unapologetic,
unapologetically and it's like the forces of nature too. It's like mountains for me. Ever since I was a kid, it's like, how do you represent the grandeur of its like complete obliviousness to the plights and the dramas that we spend so much time moaning about? How do you represent that level of like isness? I don't know, it's a hard thing to
isness is a good one. Yes I know what you mean.
Yeah,
but I love that, and I actually get that sense from some of your work, where it's like it feels like a force of nature. It feels because storms and forces of nature are as indifferent as they are powerful. Like if there's an isness that doesn't respect it, just is. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and if you're in the wake of it, there's like you're gonna be grateful.
Yes, and you might be describing awe, like the experience of awe, where like you realize you are nothing, but it kind of feels good. Not that it feels good, but it's to be obliterated. It's funny, me and my girlfriend were talking about this because we were talking about AI existential risk. And we were trying to think about these ways in which all the humans might die because we accidentally create something as powerful as like nuclear weapons.
Sure.
And then we were like, well, I'd rather die like that than like having an aneurysm on the toilet or something like that. Like, I'd rather see like
Tosin Abasi.
You feel me though? Like it might be worth dying to experience something so immense and
yeah,
inspiring.
Well, I think it's the connection to it, perhaps in the last millisecond. It's because I think a lot of the fear for things like either the forces of nature or AI, if we even is the fact that it seems it's not compassionate towards our perceived struggle. But I think, what if in the last millisecond there's an earthquake, or you're if as awful as it could be for your loved ones and all these things, you're like, oh, I'm a part of this. This is just what happens.
It's like an ultimate surrender,
in a sense. In a sense. And there's a complexity to that too, that forces you to remove yourself in order to participate in that awe.
You must be obliterated.
You must be obliterated.
Yes.
But it's also funny because I think awe is also maybe a problematic word in the sense of what we're speaking about, because it implies a surrender that is still very human, because it's like, oh my God, as opposed to, well, you are that awe. Like, it's just the earthquake in your smushed body is like a lot more, I think it's much more romantic than dying on the shitter with an aneurysm.
Yes,
you would mention the state of flow. Could you maybe define that?
Okay. Apparently, flow is a psychological conscious state of experience that usually comes when you have a balance of whether it's challenge. There needs to be a slightly structured context for it. So usually sports will produce this, or driving a car really fast, or it could be as simple as swimming a bunch of laps, but it's because of the low level. How do I put this? It is basically a conscious state that feels as if you are fully integrated to what you're doing, to where it almost feels effortless, and you don't experience the passage of time in the same way. So it is kind of a unique state of consciousness where you feel like you're in the flow. You know, I guess some athletes will describe, maybe they hit like a half point shot at the buzzer, and they just, it's almost like they're watching themselves. It's like or things are in slow motion, or it's hard to explain how they did it, but they did this thing, you know. A lot of athletes, I think, talk about these types of conscious states, but so do, I think, whenever we go to see a performer, and if they're really in the zone, there's a type of self-transcendence. I think it's why dance is utilized so readily in a lot of religious rituals. We do things to try to induce flow states, whether we know it or not. It's on the continuum of a transcendent state of consciousness. But the whole point is to like almost experience your own consciousness on a different level that almost feels higher, you know.
When you participate in a flow state, the content or the flow, the things that come out of you in that state, do you think this is something like a collective unconscious that you're tapping into, or do you think it's just, what is it that when you're in that state of flow, when it's coming out of you without yourself in the way, if I'm getting that correctly?
Mm-hmm.
So what is that? What is it?
What is the
isness, right? Like, so is the intent when you're in that flow state to represent something that is, again, beyond yourself? Or is there an intent, or is it just the joy of surrendering to something that is without that effort of like self-analysis?
Yes, the self-analysis part, because when you're in a flow state, you're not self-critical. You've transcended this analytical part of your brain. It's almost like you're more channeling. You're just doing. Like similar to isness is being, like the fundamental state of being. And so, you know, you talked about maybe escaping yourself to let something else come through. And I think our conscious minds do a lot of work, and sometimes that's impeding the experiences of our consciousness that are not verbal and not analytical. And I think music oftentimes is an expression that is, even though you can put words to music, it's not like reading. You know, it's not like hearing words, just hearing words. There's an emotional, energetic translation of things that we usually try to put words to. So I think getting to these flow states feel like you're more directly accessing this ineffable part of your conscious experience. It's less about the choices, you're just doing. You're letting it's happening. You know what I mean?
I wonder why that's so satisfying as an artist to be in that state.
I think it feels good. Even, I don't know if you consider athletes artists, but
of course, yeah.
You know, it would seem that as artists or athletes, we have taken our bodies and we've attempted to use them in this way, like a skill set over time that requires like this conscious intent and this refinement of coordination and skill. And then you can get to these states where you feel like you're automatically doing these things. And I think why it feels good is because, as someone who's learned to meditate almost 20 years ago, there are conscious states that are blissful almost because they are not your normal waking like sense of self with all the chatter in your mind and all the other shit. It's like a deep, endless ocean is right behind, just under the surface of us chatting is this endless depth of like consciousness that is us too. And so unfortunately, if we're awake, we're conscious. If we're asleep, we're fucking unconscious. To access this other state where you can experience the true depth of your consciousness sometimes it only comes from these flow states. It's like a taste of like the infinite ocean that is always you, sort of thing.
It's interesting that it's so celebrated by humanity as well, because it seems like there's a fundamental recognition of it in others when it's demonstrated, either through music or dance or anything.
Yes, we love people who access these flow states. We love what they create. We love watching them. And watch someone do something amazingly. You're like, oh my God, you know? Also, we've encoded it into like I said, there's a lot of religious rituals, and there's a lot of secular rituals that also attempt to get there. But what has sucked is most cultures have kind of branded it in a certain way. Like, so if you're not a religious person, you might be averse to some of this talk, or it sounds like woo, or it sounds hippy dippy or something. But it's like, if you're curious about consciousness as a phenomena, then it kind of opens up a different angle to perceiving what maybe spiritual and religious people have been obsessed with, but maybe getting slightly wrong in a way. And so I think as songwriters and as people who make music, like, I think when people are listening to our stuff, hopefully they're occasionally feeling like they're escaping themselves to some degree and experiencing a deeper state of, there's something about the music, you know, that is producing this conscious experience that feels transcendent. It feels more than mundane.
Interesting. I've got friends, a couple of friends simultaneously insisted I read the God Delusion, the Richard Dawkins book.
Richard Dawkins.
Yeah.
Maybe don't read it.
Well, yeah, I got through a bunch of it. And I think the thing that because I'm not smart enough to really know much about anything, to be perfectly honest, but one thing I think when I think about all these like aggressive arguments between atheistic thought and theistic thought or whatever, is it's just when you're describing the process of making music, it seems like it's a combination of two. So it's like the awe of the infinite ocean that is us, but through scientific method in a way, because you're processing it through your technique, and that the further you get into a flow state, however you get there, I think that it's almost like each layer of you that gets removed over time, it's invisible to you at the time. Like I you know, where I'm at right now, I know that, you know, I know the nature of me at this point, but once I get through this album, and I know this is as arrogant as it gets, but once I get through this album, then on the other side of it, then this passage of time that has included all these points of interest, whether or not it's a certain book or it's a certain film or it's a certain type of sound or like you say, minimalism in a certain thing or a certain type of DAW or whatever. Once you've worked through that, it's almost like the process of creating strips away the parts of you that are attached to those aesthetic qualities. Because I noticed with yourself too, it's like it changes every record. Every record, it's a different look. So that would imply that it's like, well, this is in line with my current interests, right? So when you so let me just look at my questions here. Thanks for talking to me, dude. This is great. Thank you.
No, I love it.
So what is these other ones here? I guess switching gears here and going back to people who might be watching this, who are musicians themselves or artists themselves or writers themselves. And I've been asked a lot recently, which is one of the reasons why I wanted to start doing this. It's with the internet now, people have a hard time being seen. You know, it's like it's hard to get out there. It's hard. You put all your life and all your effort into making this work and no one sees it. And then you're in this position where it's like, well, what does this mean about me? You know, the things that are so important to me being in that flow state, me finding ways to represent the ineffable qualities of me clearly mean nothing to anybody because I can't get this stuff heard. So do you think that as an artist, do you think that there's, I guess, number one, any advice you would give to them on a practical level? And number two, do you still feel that way? Do you still feel like competitive with other people when it comes to your work?
Maybe I'll answer the second question first.
Go for it.
Okay, what sucks about what I'm doing, Devin, is the whole guitar Olympics part of it. Where it's like, oh, okay, well, I got to make sure there's some fancy guitar playing here,
Okay.
and
Yeah, yeah.
there's so much talent, bro. My explore page has the most insane guitar players that you never knew exist. It's just like it's amazing, but it's also like, oh, I'm never gonna be as fast as that guy. Jesus Christ. So then I'm like, oh, I can't place my value on out shredding someone because ain't gonna win that one.
Who's that guy that plays the Abasi Concepts things? That's just a ripper, man. It's like
Steven Toronto, this dude Baxty. We have
that's
a
the guy.
few.
That's
Baxty.
the guy. Yeah,
You're just like, how does it sound like this? And bro, you've like recorded albums with Steve Vai, and you're still like, okay, so what the fuck?
Oh,
Like,
that was
how does
great for
this-
me as a young because I could tap out, right? Like I was like, yeah, no,
Yeah.
I'm just gonna play, fifths and octaves, like
Yeah.
on open and two for the rest of my career, right?
And you also shred. You also sound great. So then it's kind of like it can be true that I am not the fastest, cleanest guitar player, but I don't have to make it a competition. Let's put it that way. So I've had to talk myself down from like, what is my musical value? Is it this? Is it this sort of like shred value thing where I'm like, I always wanted that to just be one part of the puzzle. It wasn't like the center thing. So it has caused me to be like, I also have this aversion to things that I see everywhere where I kind of want to pivot and do a different thing, not because I don't like it, but just because I see it all the time. I do this with fashion. I do this like I just have a hard time feeling like part of a herd. This weird pathological commitment to individuality. So so then, and it might be even egoic, honestly. I'm sure that's part of it too. But what's nice about the amount of amazing technical players is that it's making me like, okay, well, if I'm not going to compete on that dimension, what else of musical value do I think I can bring? Because clearly there's a lot of shredders to choose from now. So,
So what's your answer to that? Because that's a great point, man. I'm sure there's a lot of people that feel exactly the same. I know I feel exactly the same way. Like, so what do you tell yourself in those moments? Has anything stuck?
You lean on what is distinct about your sound. Like no one's going to be you more than you're you. And so I'll recalibrate what I think is valuable in my music. I might even listen back to older stuff. I'll be like, okay, so if I had to distill what I think is really impactful about what I'm doing with the instrument, what do I think I can amplify? And I think melodic choices is no one is mad at impactful melodic. No one is upset of a melody they can't forget or something that made them feel something. And you know what? It's actually very hard to do. It arguably might be harder than like getting your metronome up really high and hitting all the notes correct. And I think that's where the poetry of music lies anyway. It's like, why is it that these 5 notes together feel like this? I want to put this song on again. It's like there's this thing.
Wait.
So
No, sorry, my mistake.
Well, no, that's it as far as
it lends credence to all that we've been talking about. I think it's a pretty good place to wrap it up too. It's like if you're starting or if you're in the midst of it and you're trying to get your music heard, you're trying to get your art or your literature heard, there's only you. And so if you focus your intent on identifying what it is about your process that maybe even not on an analytical way, it's like, well, what is it about what I do and who I am that I really love or I really hate or I'm really sad about or what have you? And if you can identify that in a way that the melodic ideas, because like you say, there's always going to be an Olympics for technique, whether or not that's athletic or musical, but there's no necessarily a need for a competition for melodies. There's room for as many of those as you can. Everybody who's making beautiful melodic content, it's not a competition as far as I can tell, whose melodic content is more,
who's singing faster.
Yeah, right. Who's singing. So in a sense, it's like, okay, well, just focus on identifying the parts of you that you can represent. And I think that takes a lot of getting through the fear of it, getting through the fear of complicated emotions, or the fear of failure, or the fear of success. And I think on the other side of that, the melodic things that because what you do melodically, what you guys do melodically, I've never heard it before. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact is that you're aware of, and you mentioned meditation. It's like to be able to observe your process, and to be able to observe your egocentric panic while you're sitting there is probably a great way to identify it too. It's like, oh, I do that. Clearly I do that. And I like this, and I don't like that, and this freaks me out, and whatever. And then when you're able to sit down with your instrument at those moments when your instrument yields to you, you're able to have a clearer picture, and things like the flow state as well. You're able to have a clearer picture with less baggage of who you think you are, and more of a awareness of who you are. I mean, I know there's bands that I listen to, and when I get envious, I'm like, oh, that's fucking great. Oh my God, do you hear that? That's like, oh my God, that's makes me think that everything I'm playing with puppets, and I like farts, and I'm like, oh my God, you know what I mean? But at the end of it, it's like any approximation that I make of somebody else is always going to be suspicious. But if you focus on, okay, well, this is who I am. I know myself, and this is who I am. Then I think that the people who will listen, you never have to remember anything. You never have to lie about anything, because you're like, no, man, that's where I'm at.
Yeah, no, dude, that is your whole thing. And it's interesting touring with you, because it's funny, we did a tour with you, and where there was a meet and greet, and we were doing a group meet and greet, but it was like the Devon fans, they are here to meet.
There's a lot of farts and puppets, man.
Yeah, and I was like, okay, this guy has kind of like a cult of personality thing going on, where it's like they're connecting, I think in a lot of ways beyond the music, but I think it's because of the unapologetic individuality. It's like, bro, hearing you on that last tour, I'm like, no one sounds like this. Holy like, it's all the things. It is a mountain, it is a storm, and it is you. And it's like, I think you have this commitment to like endlessly uncovering, expressing who you are through your music. And so I wouldn't change anything. I mean, I think it takes a bit of obsession, but unfortunately that's
I sense a similar thing with you. It represents itself in a arguably a more refined way than some of the
less farts.
A lot less farts. I've sent you a couple of memes, and you'd be like, dude, I am not into that, man. And I was like, oh,
dude,
wait.
I was looking for the email for the link, and then I found emails from you with some art, some Photoshop shit you were making. And I'm going to send these to you, because it's from like 2014. I don't think
the photos of you and I.
Yeah, dude.
Oh, I know.
Like face swapped us and all kind of shit. So anyway, yeah.
Well, it's like you gotta be you, right? And I think that it's like there's room for both of us. And but I really appreciate you, man. I really and Javier.
Likewise.
I fucking love Javier, man. Matt. But being with you guys is so inspiring, because it's like it's when I talk to you, I could forgive myself for thinking that your appreciation of these complex emotions was based on like an academic curiosity. But dude, I see you guys out there, and it's like real. You guys are a passionate group of dudes, man.
Yeah,
and it's like and so I know that's like, and I hear it in the music, and man, I appreciate so much that you are actively pushing towards melodic and conceptual ideas that are not the norm, because man, we need all the help we can get, right?
Yes.
I think you just got to be yourself, man, because, and again, for anybody listening, if what you're doing doesn't fit in, just do it anyway, because that's who you are, and it's like, fuck it, man. And maybe that will yield something cool, and maybe it won't, but at the end of the day, the honesty is what's going to get you through the door, I think, in my opinion.
It's what's going to get people to resonate with it too, because they can sense it. Yeah,
I agree with that 100%. I love you. It's great talking to you, and I hope your weekend's good. And thank you so much for taking the time on a Sunday night.
My pleasure, Devin.
All right, see you, buddy.
Peace.
Cheers.
The tools that make this podcast possible, provided by Roswell Microphones and X5.